The morning mist clings to the Cotswold stone like a secret refusing to fade. Gatcombe Park sits in silence, hidden behind ancient oaks and hedgerows that have stood for centuries, its golden walls catching the first light of dawn. No flags, no guards in ceremonial uniforms, no tourists pressing cameras against iron gates, just 730 acres of English countryside, rolling pastures where horses graze undisturbed, and at its heart, a Georgian manor that has remained almost invisible to the world for over 40 years. This is not Buckingham Palace. This is not Windsor Castle. This is where Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, lives her life away from the cameras, away from the protocols, away from everything the public thinks they know about royalty. The house itself speaks a language most people have forgotten. Built in the late 18th century, when King George III still ruled, and America was barely a decade old, Gatcombe Park represents something far older and far more enduring than celebrity or fame. This is old money, not the flashy kind that builds glass towers in Manhattan or buys yachts the size of warships. This is the quiet kind, the inherited kind, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself because it has been proving itself for generations. And understanding Gatcombe Park means understanding a kind of wealth that operates by entirely different rules than anything most of us will ever encounter. If you find yourself drawn to stories that move slowly, that reward patience, that refuse to give up their secrets easily, then what follows matters. These are not the stories that trend for a day and disappear. They require sitting with archives, following threads through centuries of land records and estate documents, understanding systems of wealth that were designed specifically to remain invisible. That depth, that commitment to seeing beneath the surface, only exists because people value it. Because some of us still believe that understanding how power actually works matters more than knowing who wore what dress to which event. But before we understand why Princess Anne lives here, before we can grasp what Gatcombe Park reveals about the machinery of royal wealth and the psychology of Britain's most misunderstood princess, we need to go back to when this land belonged to someone else, back to when this house was built by people whose names you have never heard but whose ambitions shaped every stone in these walls. Gatcombe Park was constructed in 1791. Think about that date for a moment. The French Revolution had just begun. The guillotine was claiming aristocratic heads across the Channel. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were less than 2 years from their executions. The old order of Europe was collapsing in blood and chaos. And yet, here in the quiet Gloucestershire countryside, someone was building a mansion. Not just any mansion, but a statement in Cotswold stone and classical proportions that declared absolute confidence in the permanence of the British aristocratic system. While France burned, England built. The original owner was a man named Edward Shepherd, a name that means nothing to most people today, which is precisely how old money prefers it. Shepherd came from a family of lawyers and landowners, people who had accumulated wealth slowly over generations through the unsexy work of legal practice, strategic marriages, and careful asset allocation. They were not flashy, they were not famous, they simply owned things, land, property, investments, and they understood something fundamental that new money often misses, that real wealth is not about spending, it is about holding, about patience, about building something that will outlast you. The architect was George Basavie, who would later design estates across England and become one of the most sought-after builders of the late Georgian period. But in 1791, he was still establishing his reputation, still proving he could balance classical elegance with practical livability. Gatcombe Park was his canvas. The house he designed followed the rules of Georgian architecture with almost religious devotion. Perfect symmetry, proportions based on mathematical ratios the ancient Greeks had used, a central block with two wings extending like arms, large sash windows arranged in precise rows. The entire structure built from the local honey-colored Cotswold stone that glows golden in sunlight and seems to absorb the landscape itself. The construction costs were never recorded in public documents. Gentlemen did not discuss money, but estate historians estimate Shepherd spent at least £10,000 building Gatcombe Park, which adjusts to approximately £1.2 million in today's currency when you account for inflation. But that number is misleading because it only captures the direct construction cost. It does not include the land, which Shepherd already owned through family inheritance. It does not include the furniture and paintings and silver that would fill the rooms. It does not include the servants' wages or the cost of maintaining the surrounding farms and tenant cottages. When you calculate total operating costs, a house like Gatcombe Park required an annual income of at least £2,000 just to maintain, roughly £240,000 in modern terms, every single year, forever. And that is the first lesson in understanding old money. It is not about the initial purchase, it is about the ability to sustain. Anyone can spend a fortune once. Only true wealth can spend it again and again, year after year, generation after generation, without ever feeling the strain. Gatcombe Park was designed for families who never had to think about money because money, properly invested and carefully managed, simply existed in the background, like air or water. The house Basseval created was elegant but not ostentatious. 11 bedrooms, drawing rooms with high ceilings and ornate plasterwork. A library because educated gentlemen were expected to own books, even if they rarely read them. A dining room sized for entertaining 20 guests at formal dinners. Kitchens and servants' quarters carefully separated from the main house, so that the work of maintaining this lifestyle remained invisible to those who benefited from it. The working class lived here too, cooks and maids and stable hands and groundskeepers, but they used separate staircases and separate entrances, moving through the house like ghosts, so that the family never had to acknowledge the labor that made their comfort possible. Outside, Basseval designed the grounds with the same careful attention to classical principles. Formal gardens near the house, gradually giving way to parkland and pasture, carefully placed trees creating sight lines and views, the whole composition designed to look natural and effortless, which of course meant it required constant maintenance by an army of gardeners whose names were never recorded in any family history. Edward Shepherd lived at Gatcombe Park for decades. He raised his children there. He died there. And when he died, the house passed to his son, who passed it to his son, who passed it to his son. This is how these systems work. The house was never sold. It was never divided among siblings. It simply moved down the male line according to rules of inheritance that had been established centuries earlier to prevent the fragmentation of family wealth. Primogeniture, it was called. The eldest son inherits everything. Younger sons had to make their own way, usually through military service or the church or marrying wealthy women. Daughters got dowries if they were lucky and were expected to marry into other families and become someone else's responsibility. For over a century and a half, Gatcombe Park changed hands this way, moving through families whose names shifted through marriages and deaths, but whose relationship to wealth remained constant. They were not the richest people in England. They were not the most powerful. They were simply landed gentry, a class that owned enough to live comfortably without working, that married within their own circle, that understood their job was not to increase the wealth but simply to maintain it and pass it on. The house itself evolved slowly. New wings were added in the 1830s. The interiors were updated to match Victorian tastes, gardens were redesigned. But the core remained the same, a Georgian country house on Gloucestershire farmland, generating income from tenant farmers who worked the surrounding acres, providing a comfortable life for people whose primary occupation was managing their own inherited comfort. And then the 20th century arrived and everything began to crack. 2 world wars destroyed the system that families like the Shepherds depended on. Death duties, what we now call inheritance tax, were introduced to fund the war effort and were never repealed. Suddenly, every time the house changed hands, the government demanded payment, not a small payment, a significant percentage of the estate's value. And unlike previous generations, mid-20th century inheritors often did not have the liquid capital to pay these taxes because the wealth was all tied up in the land and the house itself. They were asset rich and cash poor, a liquidity crisis that destroyed thousands of country estates across England. The farms stopped generating enough income to maintain the house because agricultural prices collapsed and tenants could no longer afford their rents. The servants disappeared because working class people now had other options: factory jobs, shop work, anything that paid better and demanded less degradation than serving wealthy families who treated them as invisible. Operating costs skyrocketed as coal heating gave way to oil, as ancient plumbing needed replacement, as roofs that had lasted a century finally needed repair. By the 1960s, families across England were making terrible calculations. Keep the house and go bankrupt maintaining it. Sell the house and lose the family seat that had defined their identity for generations. Give the house to the National Trust and watch it become a tourist attraction where strangers pay £5 to walk through your ancestors' bedrooms. None of these options felt acceptable, yet one had to be chosen. Gatcombe Park faced exactly this crisis. The family that owned it in the 1960s could no longer afford to maintain it. The house needed repairs they could not fund. The death duties from the previous generation's passing had consumed most of the liquid assets. The land was not generating sufficient income. They needed to sell, but finding a buyer for a property like Gatcombe Park is not simple. You cannot just list it with an estate agent and hope for the best. You need someone with not only the capital to purchase, but also the ongoing wealth to maintain it. You need someone who wants to live in rural Gloucestershire, far from London's social scene. You need someone who understands what it means to own a listed historic property where you cannot simply renovate as you please because the building is legally protected. You need, in short, exactly the kind of buyer who almost does not exist anymore. And that is when the royal family became interested. The year was 1976. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, had been married to Captain Mark Phillips for 3 years. They had a young son, Peter, and another child on the way. They had been living in various royal residences, apartments in Buckingham Palace, rooms at Windsor, but they wanted something different. They wanted privacy. They wanted land where Mark could pursue his passion for horses and equestrian sports. They wanted, perhaps most importantly, a life that felt somewhat normal, or at least as normal as life can feel when your mother is Queen Elizabeth II. The traditional solution would have been for the Queen to purchase a property for them as she had done for other family members. But Anne and Mark apparently wanted to do this differently. They wanted a home that felt like theirs, not just another royal property. So they went looking for a country estate they could buy themselves, or more accurately, that the Queen could buy for them in a way that created the appearance of independence while still being funded by family wealth. Gatcombe Park came on the market at exactly the right moment. It was remote enough to provide privacy, but close enough to London for royal duties. It had enough land for horses and farming. It was historically significant without being so grand that it felt like a museum. And perhaps most importantly, it was available for £730,000, about £5.5 million in today's money when adjusted for inflation, which sounds like an enormous sum until you realize that comparable country estates in better condition were selling for twice that amount. Gatcombe Park was a bargain, but only if you had the resources to bring it back to life. Queen Elizabeth II purchased the property as a wedding present for Princess Anne and Captain Mark Phillips. That is the official story. The reality, as always with royal finances, is more complicated and more carefully structured than the simple phrase wedding present suggests. Before we move forward, consider what you are witnessing here. Not a fairy tale, not a princess given a castle by her loving mother, but rather a sophisticated piece of asset allocation, a strategic deployment of generational wealth designed to provide privacy and security while maintaining a particular image. These mechanisms, the trusts and the purchases, and the carefully worded announcements are how real power perpetuates itself, not through drama, but through boring financial instruments most people never think about. The purchase was structured through private family wealth, not through public funds. This distinction matters enormously. The Queen's private wealth, which comes from investments, property holdings, and inheritances that have nothing to do with taxpayers, is vast but carefully hidden behind layers of trusts and holding companies. When she purchased Gatcombe Park, she did so as a private individual making a real estate investment, not as a monarch spending public money. The property was titled in Princess Anne's name, creating legal ownership that appeared independent, while the actual capital came from family sources. This is how old money works. It creates structures that appear to be one thing while actually being something else. Princess Anne owns Gatcombe Park in the sense that her name is on the deed, but the Queen provided the purchase price. And when Anne and Mark Phillips divorced in 1992, the property settlement was handled privately in ways that kept Gatcombe Park in Anne's possession despite Mark having lived there for 16 years. Money that never truly left the family was arranged to look like it had, then arranged again to return where it started. The purchase in 1976 was just the beginning. Gatcombe Park required extensive renovation. The house had been neglected for years. Roofs leaked, plumbing was Victorian, electrical systems were dangerous. The estimated cost to make it livable was at least another £500,000, roughly $4 million in today's money. And beyond renovation was the ongoing cost of maintenance, staff salaries, groundskeepers, stable hands for the horses, farm managers for the agricultural land, security, because even though Anne wanted privacy, she was still a royal target for kidnapping or worse. The total initial investment, purchase plus renovation, came to approximately £9.5 million in modern currency. And the annual operating costs to maintain a property this size run between £400,000 and £600,000 every year, adjusted for inflation, depending on how much entertaining is done and how extensively the grounds are maintained. These are numbers that sound large but only mean something when you understand the wealth behind them. Queen Elizabeth II's private fortune has been estimated at various times between 300 million and 500 million pounds, though the true figure is impossible to know because royal wealth is among the most carefully guarded secrets in Britain. But even using conservative estimates, purchasing and maintaining Gatcombe Park represented less than 2% of her total assets, a rounding error essentially. The kind of purchase you make without feeling it, the way someone making £50,000 a year might buy a £900 television. This is the machinery of generational wealth, not spending everything you have on one grand gesture, but deploying a tiny fraction of nearly unlimited resources to solve a specific problem, in this case providing privacy and independence for a daughter who had never asked for the life she was born into. If you are still here, still following the financial architecture beneath the fairy tale, you are recognizing something most people miss, that these stories matter. Not because royalty is special, but because royalty reveals in concentrated form how all inherited wealth operates. The mechanisms are the same whether we are talking about £500 million or 5 million. The goal is always the same. Preserve the capital, maintain the assets, pass it forward. And if this is making you uncomfortable, if you are starting to see systems you never noticed before, then what you are feeling is the beginning of understanding. Princess Anne moved into Gatcombe Park in 1977 with Mark Phillips and their son Peter. Their daughter Zara would be born there in 1981. And for the next 4 decades, Anne has lived in this house more consistently than any other royal has lived anywhere. Not Buckingham Palace, not Windsor Castle, not Kensington Palace, Gatcombe Park. This became her home in a way that royal properties rarely become homes. And this is where the story gets interesting, because what Anne did with Gatcombe Park reveals far more about who she is than any official biography ever could. She did not turn it into a showplace. She did not open it for tours. She did not install gold faucets or build monuments to herself. Instead, she turned it into a working farm. A real farm, not a gentleman's hobby farm. Gatcombe Park operates as a commercial agricultural enterprise, producing crops and raising livestock that are sold at market rates. The estate employs farm managers and agricultural workers. The land is actively worked. This is not Marie Antoinette playing shepherdess at Versailles. This is a genuine agricultural operation that happens to be owned by a princess. The equestrian facilities at Gatcombe Park are world class. Anne was an Olympic equestrian herself. She competed in the 1976 Montreal Olympics, the first British royal ever to compete in the Olympic Games. Her daughter Zara followed in her footsteps, winning an Olympic silver medal in 2012. The estate hosts major equestrian competitions, including the Festival of British Eventing, which brings thousands of spectators to the grounds every summer. Anne could have kept Gatcombe entirely private, but instead she allows public events that celebrate the sport she loves. The house itself remains almost entirely private. Anne has given perhaps a dozen interviews there in 40 years. She has allowed cameras inside only a handful of times, always for documentary purposes, never for entertainment. There are no official photographs of most rooms. Architectural historians have never been allowed to fully survey the interior. What happens inside Gatcombe Park remains largely unknown, which in an age of social media and constant exposure is itself a radical act. This is the paradox of Princess Anne. She is simultaneously one of the hardest working royals. She performs more official engagements annually than almost anyone else in the family, and one of the most private. She will spend a day visiting hospitals and schools and charities, fulfilling the public duties that come with her position, and then she will return to Gatcombe Park and disappear completely. No paparazzi photographs, no leaked stories, no drama. Just work and then privacy, work and then privacy, maintained with a discipline that has never wavered in 47 years. And understanding this pattern reveals something crucial about how Anne views wealth and privilege. She was born into staggering advantage, second child of the Queen of England, given everything from birth, protected and provided for in ways 99.9% of humanity can never imagine. But she has spent her entire adult life trying to earn that advantage through work, not because she needs to work. She does not need money, she does not need status, she does not need to prove anything to anyone, but because she apparently cannot accept being merely ornamental. The psychology of inherited wealth is rarely discussed honestly. Most people who inherit great fortunes either feel entitled to them, believing they somehow deserve what they were simply born into, or they feel guilty about them, engaging in performative displays of humility while still benefiting from every advantage. Princess Anne seems to have chosen a third path: acknowledgement without apology. She never pretends she is not privileged. She never claims her life is difficult in ways that would insult people facing real hardship. But she also refuses to be merely decorative, refuses to live as if the privilege comes with no obligation. Gatcombe Park is the physical manifestation of this philosophy. It is not a palace. It is not open to the public. It is not used for grand state occasions. It is simply a house where someone who happens to be royal lives a life that is as close to normal as her circumstances allow. The working farm is not a vanity project. It operates at a profit most years, contributing to the estate's financial sustainability rather than being a drain on resources. The equestrian competitions are not exclusive royal events. Anyone can buy a ticket and attend. The privacy is not enforced with armed guards and prosecuted trespassers, but rather with walls and hedges, and the simple fact that the house is far enough from main roads that you would have to actively seek it out to find it. When Anne and Mark Phillips divorced in 1992, there was speculation that Gatcombe Park would be sold or divided. Mark had helped manage the equestrian facilities and had lived there for 16 years, but the property settlement was handled privately, and Mark moved out, eventually remarrying and moving to Gloucestershire, where he still trains horses. Anne kept Gatcombe Park, and she remains there today, now with her second husband, Vice Admiral Sir Timothy Lawrence, whom she married later in 1992. The choice to stay at Gatcombe Park after the divorce reveals something important. Anne could have started fresh somewhere else. She could have asked her mother for a different property, something without the memories of a failed marriage. But she stayed because Gatcombe Park had become home, and home apparently mattered more than comfort or forgetting. Her children, Peter and Zara Phillips, both grew up at Gatcombe Park. Neither has royal titles. Anne and Mark made the deliberate choice not to give them titles, believing it would allow them more normal lives. Both attended regular schools, not exclusive royal academies. Both have pursued careers outside royal duties. Peter worked in sports management and banking. Zara became a professional equestrian before retiring and now works in various commercial ventures. They both married commoners and had children who also have no titles. This is generational wealth making a choice. Anne could have insisted her children receive titles, could have positioned them for lives of ceremonial duties and public funding. Instead, she gave them what she apparently valued most: relative freedom. They grew up with every material advantage, educated at excellent schools, introduced to influential people, financially secure through family trusts. But they were not trapped by the formal requirements of royal life. Zara Phillips and her husband Mike Tyndall now live on the Gatcombe Park estate in a separate residence. Peter Phillips lived there for years before eventually moving nearby. This is another pattern of generational wealth. The estate becomes not just one house, but a complex of properties where multiple generations can live near each other while maintaining separate lives. The land is large enough to accommodate several households without anyone feeling crowded. The wealth is sufficient to maintain multiple residences, and the family structure keeps everyone close without forcing constant interaction. Before we continue to where this story leads, pause on what we have just witnessed. Multiple generations living on inherited land, using inherited wealth, maintaining inherited property, all while insisting they are living normal lives and working hard. Are they working hard? Yes, genuinely. Anne has fulfilled more official engagements than almost any other royal for decades, but she is working hard from a position of absolute security without ever facing the consequences of failure, without ever risking homelessness or hunger or any of the things that make work precarious for most people. Understanding this duality, genuine effort within a system of absolute advantage, is crucial to understanding how class actually works. The current state of Gatcombe Park reflects 4 decades of careful stewardship. The house has been maintained to the highest standards without being ostentatiously upgraded. The grounds are immaculate without being showy. The farm operates profitably, or at least breaks even most years, which for a country estate is itself an achievement. The equestrian facilities are among the best in England, and the whole operation employs dozens of local people: farm workers, groundskeepers, stable hands, house staff, providing working-class jobs in a rural area where employment options are limited. This is the defense old money always offers. We provide employment, we maintain historic properties, we contribute to local economies, and it is true as far as it goes. Gatcombe Park does employ people. It does preserve a historic house. It does host events that bring tourism money to the area, but it also concentrates enormous wealth in a single family, provides them with a lifestyle unavailable to everyone who works for them, and perpetuates systems where accident of birth determines everything. Princess Anne is now 74 years old. She has lived at Gatcombe Park for 47 years, longer than most people live anywhere. She has survived a kidnapping attempt in 1974 before she moved to Gatcombe Park. A man tried to abduct her on a London street, shooting 4 people in the attempt before Anne's composure and resistance foiled the plot. She has survived a failed marriage and the constant scrutiny of being royal. She has worked more royal engagements than anyone except her parents. And through it all, Gatcombe Park has been her refuge, the place she returns to after everything else, the one piece of real estate that is genuinely hers. The question of what happens to Gatcombe Park after Anne is worth considering. Will it stay in the family, passing to Zara or Peter? Will it return to the Crown Estate, the vast property holdings technically owned by the monarch but managed independently? Will it be sold, ending the royal connection and beginning another chapter in the house's long history? These decisions are likely already made, structured through trusts and legal instruments that normal people never use and rarely understand. Whatever happens, it will be presented as natural and inevitable, the way changes in generational wealth always are. If you have stayed with this story and through all its tangents and complications, through the financial details and the psychological speculation, then you have demonstrated the kind of patience that most content does not reward anymore. Everything now is designed for short attention spans, for quick hits of emotion, for immediate satisfaction. Stories like this, slow, layered, refusing to offer simple conclusions, survive only because some people still value them. And if you are one of those people, if this mattered to you in a way you cannot quite articulate yet, then perhaps that is worth acknowledging. But there is another layer to Gatcombe Park that we have not yet discussed. Another story hidden inside the story, the question of kidding in human terms rather than financial ones. Every great house has invisible people, servants, workers, the ones who make the system function while remaining carefully unseen. Gatcombe Park in 1791 required a staff of at least 20 people to operate: cooks, maids, footmen, stable hands, groundskeepers. These people worked 14-hour days, lived in cramped quarters in the attics or outbuildings, earned wages that barely allowed survival. They could not leave easily because employment references were essential, and wealthy families would blackball servants who left without permission. They could be dismissed on a moment's notice for the smallest infraction. Their entire lives revolved around making the lives of the Shepherd family comfortable, while their own comfort was barely considered. These were not slaves. England had abolished slavery in the early 1800s, but they were not truly free either. Economic necessity bound them to employment that was often degrading and always exhausting. They called their employers Sir and Madam and never spoke unless spoken to. They used back staircases and servants' hallways, so the family never had to see them unless they were actively serving. They ate the leftovers from the family's meals, wore secondhand clothes, slept in unheated rooms, and considered themselves fortunate if they could save enough to retire to a tiny cottage in old age. This was the machinery that made Gatcombe Park possible. The elegant proportions and beautiful interiors and manicured gardens existed because invisible people worked constantly to maintain them. And the family that benefited from this labor convinced themselves it was natural, that servants were simply a different class of person who belonged in a different place, that the hierarchy was ordained by God or nature or tradition, and therefore required no justification. When Princess Anne took possession of Gatcombe Park in 1976, that system had mostly collapsed. Servants had been replaced by employees with contracts and employment rights. The 20-person staff of 1791 had become perhaps a dozen employees in the 1970s, and those employees had days off and overtime pay and the ability to quit if they found better work. The relationship had shifted from feudal to merely unequal, but the fundamental dynamic remained. Gatcombe Park still requires people to clean and maintain and manage. Those people still earn far less than the value they create. They still cannot afford to live in houses like Gatcombe Park themselves, and they still spend their working lives making comfortable the lives of people who were born into comfort and will never experience anything else. Anne herself, by all accounts, treats her employees with respect. She is not cruel. She does not humiliate or degrade. She apparently recognizes the work being done on her behalf and expresses gratitude. But respect within an unequal system is not the same as equality. The employees at Gatcombe Park still go home to smaller houses, still worry about money in ways Anne never has, still face a future where they will work until they are too old to work, and then survive on pensions that may or may not be adequate. This is not a problem Anne created. She inherited a system, just as she inherited wealth and status. But she benefits from it every day, and that benefit comes at a cost to others, even if the cost is less visible than it was 200 years ago. The same analysis applies to the land itself. Gatcombe Park sits on 730 acres that were enclosed centuries ago through acts of parliament that took common land away from ordinary people and gave it to wealthy landowners. The farmers who had used that land for generations suddenly found themselves trespassing on property that had been declared private. They had to become tenant farmers, paying rent to work land their ancestors had used freely. Or they had to leave, moving to cities to find factory work, beginning the long process of urbanization that would eventually empty the English countryside of its traditional inhabitants. That history is buried now. The enclosures happened so long ago that they feel like ancient history, not relevant to modern life. But the consequences persist. 730 acres in Gloucestershire remain in the hands of one family because centuries ago, laws were written by wealthy men to benefit wealthy men, and those acres generate income and provide privacy and create space for horses and farms and all the things that make Gatcombe Park valuable, while ordinary people crowd into smaller and smaller spaces because all the land was long ago claimed. Anne did not enclose that land. She did not write those laws, but she benefits from them. And that benefit is permanent, passed down through generations, defended by legal structures designed specifically to prevent redistribution. Understanding this does not require hating Princess Anne. She is, by available evidence, a decent person who works hard within the constraints of her position. But understanding this does require acknowledging that decency within an unjust system is not the same as justice, that working hard from a position of infinite privilege is not the same as earning your position, that maintaining property acquired through historical injustice does not become moral simply because enough time has passed. These are uncomfortable truths. They do not fit neatly into narratives about hardworking royals or charming country estates. They complicate the story in ways that make us question structures we usually take for granted. And if you are feeling that discomfort right now, if this is making you reconsider assumptions about wealth and fairness and what people deserve, then perhaps that discomfort is the point. The question we opened with, what is the secret story behind Princess Anne's mansion, has an answer now, though perhaps not the one you expected. The secret is not scandal or hidden treasure or royal intrigue. The secret is simply this, that old money operates by rules designed to perpetuate itself, that generational wealth is a system, not an accident, that houses like Gatcombe Park exist because laws and customs and social structures have been carefully constructed over centuries to ensure that people born into advantage never lose it. Princess Anne lives at Gatcombe Park because her mother was queen and could purchase it for her. She keeps Gatcombe Park because the wealth that maintains it is protected by trusts and legal structures that prevent its dissipation. Her children will inherit wealth because she inherited wealth. Their children will inherit because they will inherit. And this pattern will continue until either the system changes or the family makes choices that break it. The house itself is beautiful, the grounds are stunning, the management appears responsible, and the treatment of employees seems fair by the standards of class-stratified societies. But none of that changes the fundamental reality that some people are born into 730-acre estates in the Cotswolds and most people are not, and that difference is maintained by systems that present themselves as natural when they are actually constructed. If this story has revealed something you did not expect, if it has shifted your understanding in ways that feel important, even if you cannot yet articulate why, then perhaps it is worth sharing with others who might benefit from the same shift. Not because you need to agree with every interpretation offered here, but because these questions about wealth and inheritance and fairness and what we owe each other matter more than most of what fills our days. Princess Anne will likely live at Gatcombe Park for the rest of her life. The house will continue to be maintained to the highest standards. The farm will continue to operate. The horses will continue to graze in the pastures. And most people will continue to never think about how all of this is possible, what systems make it work, what histories enable it, what costs are hidden in the beauty. But some of us will think about it. Some of us will ask questions that have no comfortable answers. Some of us will recognize that understanding power requires looking not at what is visible and dramatic, but at what is invisible and mundane. The real mechanisms of class are not found in crowns and ceremonies, but in property law and trust structures and inheritance rules, in houses that pass from generation to generation, while the people who clean those houses can barely afford rent. Gatcombe Park is beautiful. It is historic. It is well managed. And it is a monument to inequality so normalized that most people never notice it. All of these things are true simultaneously. Holding that contradiction, appreciating beauty while recognizing injustice, respecting work while acknowledging that work from privilege is fundamentally different from work under precarity, is difficult. It requires thinking in ways our culture does not encourage. It requires seeing systems rather than individuals, patterns rather than exceptions. But if we cannot do that difficult thinking, if we cannot hold those contradictions, then we cannot understand how the world actually works. We can only enjoy the surface, the pretty pictures, the fairy tales. And maybe that is enough for most people. Maybe most people do not want to understand. Maybe most people prefer the comfort of not knowing. But you stayed. You read this far, which means you are not most people, which means you chose understanding over comfort, even when understanding meant confronting things you might wish were different. And that choice, small as it seems, matters. It is the beginning of seeing clearly. And seeing clearly is always the first step toward anything changing. The mist will lift from Gatcombe Park tomorrow morning, just as it lifted this morning and has lifted every morning for 233 years. The golden Cotswold stone will glow in the dawn light. The horses will graze in the pastures. Princess Anne will wake in her bedroom and begin another day of balancing public duty with private life. And the house will stand, solid and permanent, maintained by work that mostly goes unnoticed, protected by wealth that mostly goes unexamined, continuing a pattern that has defined English country estates for centuries. Nothing will change at Gatcombe Park, because nothing needs to change at Gatcombe Park. The system works, at least for the people the system was designed to serve. For everyone else, for the ones who work there or live nearby, simply drive past without ever thinking about what lies behind those hedgerows, the system works differently, or does not work at all. And that is the final secret, the one that hides in plain sight, that some lives are designed to be comfortable from birth to death, maintained by inherited wealth and protected by centuries of accumulated advantage, while other lives are designed to provide that comfort, to do the work that makes privilege possible, to remain invisible so that the comfortable never have to confront the cost of their comfort. Princess Anne did not design this system, but she lives at its apex. And Gatcombe Park, beautiful and historic and well managed as it is, stands as evidence of exactly how that system functions when you know where to look. The gates remain closed, the money remains secured, the story continues. And now you know why. The silence at Gatcombe Park is not empty. It is full of choices made centuries ago that still echo in every stone, every acre, every morning when Princess Anne wakes in a house most people will never see. The silence is full of servants who scrubbed floors in 1791, whose names no one recorded. It is full of tenant farmers who paid rent on land their grandparents had worked freely. It is full of laws written in Parliament by men who owned 50,000 acres, deciding what would happen to families who owned nothing. And in that silence lives a question no one in power wants to answer. What would fairness actually look like? Not the shallow fairness of treating employees with respect or maintaining historic properties well or working hard despite privilege, but the deeper fairness that asks why some families get to hold 730 acres for generations while others struggle to afford a single room. The fairness that questions whether accident of birth should determine everything. The fairness that wonders if perhaps, just perhaps, the current arrangement is not inevitable or natural, but simply what those with power have chosen to maintain because it serves them. Princess Anne cannot answer this question. Neither can anyone else who benefits from generational wealth. because to truly answer it would require acknowledging that the system is not meritocracy, not reward for talent or hard work, but simply inheritance. And inheritance, examined honestly, is just luck. Birth lottery, the cosmic accident of which family you emerged into, which determines whether you will live in Gatcombe Park or clean Gatcombe Park, or never see Gatcombe Park except in photographs. The house will stand regardless. Georgian architecture is built to last. The Cotswold stone will glow golden for centuries more. Future generations will live there, whoever they are, maintaining the pattern. And most people will continue to accept this as normal, as how things are, as something that requires no justification beyond tradition. But tradition is just another word for decisions made long ago that we have stopped questioning. And the moment we stop questioning is the moment we accept that some people matter more than others, that some lives deserve comfort and privacy and beauty and space, while other lives deserve whatever remains after the comfortable have taken their share. Gatcombe Park could be many things. It could be a school. It could be housing for 100 families. It could be a public park where anyone could walk freely under those ancient oaks. It could serve the many instead of the few, but it does not. Because the system that determines such things was designed by the few to serve the few. And that system continues, generation after generation, protected by law and custom and the general exhaustion of people too tired from working to question why things are the way they are. This is not a call for revolution. This is simply the truth, spoken plainly. Gatcombe Park exists as it does because power perpetuates itself, because wealth, once concentrated, uses every tool available to remain concentrated, because the alternative, redistribution, equality, fairness beyond symbolic gestures, would require those with everything to accept having less. And history suggests they will not do that willingly, so the gates stay closed. The estate remains private. The pattern continues, and we tell ourselves stories about hard-working princesses and well-maintained heritage and tradition and history. We tell ourselves anything except the simple truth that this is what inequality looks like when it has had centuries to perfect itself: beautiful, historic, permanent, and fundamentally unjust. The morning mist will return tomorrow, and nothing will change unless we decide it should.